So please, Bryan, over to you.
Thank you for the kind of introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I want to talk about cruise ships and how they always seem to go the wrong direction when they're taking action that they proclaim to be an environmental good. When upon closer inspection, it all starts to fall apart. And as part of this presentation, I'll be going through the research that my team has done over the last several years that relates to cruise ships and their choices and the impacts on the environment, and in particular, how we can fix some of this using policy. So cruise companies are often early adopters of new technologies and of new fuels. And without fail, they market these as the next great thing, the next clean solution. But when you take a closer look, they have negative side effects, both for people and for the environment, that are often swept under the rug until groups like yours and researchers like my group shed light on them. Two examples are scrubbers and liquefied natural gas, LNG. And I'll be discussing the environmental trade-offs of these and ways that policymakers can use their power to better protect people and the planet. So let's start with scrubbers. Scrubber installations ramped up ahead of the International Maritime Organization's 2020 fuel sulfur rule. So before 2020, ships that are operating on the high seas were able to use heavy fuel oil that contained up to 35,000 parts per million sulfur. And you can compare that to 15 parts per million sulfur for on-road diesel fuel for trucks in the US and 10 for trucks in the European Union. And after 2020, or starting in 2020, that global limit reduced to 5,000 parts per million. So an improvement, but still not anywhere close to what we use for on-road fuels. And in emission control areas, like we have one extending off the coast of North America, and then there's also one in Europe. In these emission control areas, those that sulfur limit is 1,000 parts per million. So before 2020, we saw some uptake of sulfur scrubbers for ships that are operating in emission control areas. Cruise ships tend to operate a lot in emission control areas going up and down the coast. And so the early adopters of scrubbers were cruise ships. And then now that ships have to use lower sulfur fuel on the high seas, instead of using that fuel, which is more expensive, many ships have opted for installing sulfur scrubbers to continue to use the cheap heavy fuel oil and just remove the sulfur from the exhaust. And scrubbers are used to save on fuel costs. Historically, it's cost about 50% more to use the cleaner compliant fuel. So the gray line shows something called marine gas oil. That's the fuel that meets the emission control area requirements. It's less than 1,000 parts per million sulfur. And the red line is the high sulfur heavy fuel oil. And when you get towards the right-hand side of this graph, you can see the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It increased prices and it also increased the price gap. And that was actually a good thing for those in the industry that have installed scrubbers, including the cruise industry, because now suddenly their competitors that don't have scrubbers are paying twice as much for their fuel as they are. So scrubbers are used to reduce one air pollutant, sulfur oxides, but all of the regulations completely ignore any other air quality impacts. And there are guidelines for the water that's discharged as a consequence of using scrubbers, water from the ship that I'll talk about. But those guidelines, we looked into them, and they're set at a level that every ship can comply with. So when those rules were made, the regulators at the International Maritime Organization looked at what scrubbers emitted and then set the limits greater than that. And they've never been revised to be stronger since they were first established in 2008. Here's a diagram of a scrubber. It looks a little complicated, but the basic idea is that you take high sulfur exhaust in, you spray it with seawater in the tall cylinder, and then you get low sulfur exhaust out. But when you spray it with the water, you collect it in the tanks toward the bottom. And you'll see this little outlet here with some water coming out. And it looks okay in this diagram, but if you were to actually look over the side of a cruise ship when they're discharging the wash water from the scrubber, this is what you might see. This is from Alaska's Ocean Ranger program, which has been disbanded. I think some of you are well aware of that, even though it was funded by cruise passengers and not taxpayers. It'd be great if this came back. But this is a picture taken by a professional ocean ranger on board a cruise ship when it was in Alaska. You can see the sulfur in the yellow plume. And then if you look to the left, you can actually see a sheen. And that's some of the oil that was collected when the exhaust was sprayed. And so this discharge water contains sulfates, nitrates. Nitrates lead to eutrophication, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, fancy words for oil pollution, and heavy metals, which are carcinogens and persistent. They don't go away. And these pollutants have been linked to reproductive dysfunction in marine mammals, including resident killer whales, which I'll talk about later. Cruise ships rely heavily on scrubbers. If you look at the blue bars in this graph, this shows you the proportion of the number of ships in the fleet that are equipped with scrubbers as of the end of 2020 after the IMO's fuel sulfur rule went into effect. And you can see that about a third of cruise ships had them installed. And some cruise companies have just gone all in on scrubbers. For example, Carnival has 85% of their ships, which is a fleet of about 100, have installed scrubbers. And then otherwise, they're using LNG most of the time. So the cruise industry really is either going for the scrubber solution or the LNG solution because they comply with regulations. But many of you will recognize that the regulations that are set, especially those that are set at the International Maritime Organization, even though it's a United Nations agency and you would think that that has some high standards, it ends up being the lowest common denominator because it's an organization that's made up chiefly of representatives from the transport departments of member states and also from the industry. So we end up with fairly weak regulations at the IMO, even though you might think that they should be the gold standard. So compliance does not mean safety. And you can see that other ship types really, if you look at the blue bars, they're taking advantage of scrubbers, but not to the same level that cruise ships are. And indeed, cruise ships are a disproportionate source of scrubber pollution. Cruise ships are just 4% of the scrubber-equipped fleet, but they create 15% of the pollution, which you can see in the yellow portion. If you look at global discharges of scrubber wash water that contains all of these pollutants, it's 10 gigatons. And to put that into perspective, the international shipping sector itself transports 11 gigatons of cargo each year. So they're running huge amounts of seawater through these systems and discharging not only on the high seas, but also near shore and in port when they're at the dock itself. And cruise ports are the ports that suffer the most from scrubber pollution. We modeled the scrubber discharges from the global scrubber-equipped fleet, and then we ranked the ports by the total amount of scrubber discharges by mass. And if you look at the top 10, all of them, the majority is from cruise ships, and in 7 out of the top 10, it's more than 96% of the scrubber pollution is from cruise ships, and in Georgetown, Cayman Islands, all of it's from cruise ships. And so a lot of these ports, especially in the Caribbean, are also located in areas where there's coral reef systems that are already suffering the ill effects of ocean acidification due to climate change, and the scrubber wash water itself is acidic. And so it's adding insult to injury in this case as well. And I mentioned before that the pollutants that come out of the scrubbers that normally would go out of the exhaust they're being collected, concentrated, and discharged overboard. And these are happening all over. And there's really no areas where there's scrubber restrictions, except in a few select instances, which I'll cover in a little bit. One example is critical habitat for resident killer whales off the coast of Vancouver, and then also we looked at Vancouver, British Columbia, but these orcas also, their range extends down the west coast of the United States, including Washington State. We analyzed scrubber pollution from 30 ships near British Columbia in 2017. This is before the IMO's global sulfur regulation. And so most of the ships that were using scrubbers in this area, which is part of the North American emission control area, where you have to have lower sulfur fuel that's more expensive, or use a scrubber, right? So the cruise ships are using scrubbers in these areas. And this is a map of the scrubber discharges. And we've zoomed into the critical habitat for the northern resident killer whales and the southern resident killer whales. And you can see that actually there's quite a lot of ship traffic and scrubber discharges in these areas, and the pollutants that are emitted have been linked to reproductive dysfunction in marine mammals. So it's really not a great situation. And luckily, Port of Vancouver has taken the first steps to reduce some of this pollution, but they can only control inside their port boundaries. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Taking the bigger picture, the International Maritime Organization has designated 15 areas around the world as particularly sensitive sea areas. Most of them are designated that way because of their coral reef systems. And this map, the bigger map, shows all of the scrubber discharges, and you can see the trade patterns. And then we've zoomed in on 3 different areas. You want to focus on A, which is around the Florida Keys, and then C, which is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, the particularly sensitive sea area. So you can see near Miami, which is a huge cruise port, lots of scrubber discharges, including inside the particularly sensitive sea area. This is an area with coral reefs. And then, of course, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, there are ships that are coming into these 3 ports that are coal export terminals. And those ships are bulk carriers that are transporting that coal, and they're using scrubbers and discharging inside of this area. So, I mean, it doesn't take, you don't have to have a PhD in environmental science or ecology to figure out that this is not a great idea. And yet it's allowed in particularly sensitive sea areas. There's suggestions on voluntary routing around these areas, avoid these areas. But if there's a coal terminal, right, the ships are going in and out. And it's all voluntary. And there's no restrictions on scrubber discharges in these areas. Policies can help. And I mentioned Port of Vancouver earlier. In March of 2022, they implemented a ban on discharging scrubber wash water when ships are at berth. So when they're tied up to shore, they can't discharge. Normally, ships, including cruise ships, would be idling while they're at the dock, unless they plug into shore power. Even though Vancouver has shore power, not all ships are using it. And so this was the first step. There's 3 phases that they're implementing. The first is no discharges at berth. The second is no discharges within the port boundaries. I'm hoping that phase will be implemented this year, but they haven't given a timeline. And then the third is you can't use scrubbers even if you hold the discharge on board, which very few ships are capable of doing in the first place, and only temporarily. So they would just take that and they would go offshore and dump it anyway. But at least it would prevent it from in the port boundaries where there's shallower water. So this particular restriction, when they, actually, I think the the ban was at berth or at anchor. So this first phase eliminates 88% of the pollution that's happening in the Port of Vancouver's jurisdiction. So policies can definitely help, and Port of Vancouver has been taking the lead on this one recently. There are other countries that have similar bans. Here's a table of those that had them in place as of June 2020. And you can see a variety of countries. Many of these are happening, the discharge restrictions are in ports, and then some have gone as far as their territorial seas, like Malaysia. And then Brazil, they walked back they're number 2 on this list. They walked back their restrictions. They came to the IMO and said that we got this wrong on our report, even though we did find documentation that it was supposed to be restricted. So apparently they did an about face. These restrictions avoid 4% of the discharges that would have occurred globally, and about 1/5 of the discharges that would have occurred in national waters. So even these this list here of countries that have implemented restrictions are having an impact, and that's one way that jurisdictions can take it upon themselves to impose restrictions,